Anyone following today's news almost certainly noticed the headline and the viral clip. There was Mitch McConnell at the Senate podium speaking in the chamber, delivering remarks that many are already describing as the most pivotal address of his entire career. The lower third graphic on your screen probably used words like breakup or feud, casting it as yet another episode in the long, chaotic relationship between the Senate Minority Leader and the former president. But stopping at that interpretation means missing what really happened. This was not a moment of raw emotion. It was not a personal score being settled in public. What unfolded on that floor was a deliberate institutional move carefully designed to realign the internal power dynamics of the Republican Party. If you understand how authority truly shifts in Washington, figures like McConnell don't torch bridges unless another path is already in place. What we witnessed today was the unveiling of that path. Most people saw a speech. What I saw was a signal being sent, a permission structure constructed piece by piece for 49 other senators who have been waiting for the green light to act. I want to walk you through exactly what happened. Not just what was said into the microphone, but what was being communicated to the donors, the whips, and the wavering members of the conference who were watching from their desks. We often talk about political earthquakes, and usually it is hyperbole. Today, it isn't. To understand why this moment is different, you have to look past the drama and look at the mechanics. McConnell is a creature of the Senate. He cares about the institution and his majority more than he cares about any single politician. And for years, he has navigated a delicate balance with Donald Trump. He has absorbed attacks, he has stayed silent when others spoke out, and he has always prioritized the long game. That's what makes today's speech so unsettling. It tells you the math has shifted. Staying aligned now carries a higher price than walking away. And McConnell didn't quietly fade into the background. He cut the connection cleanly with a lawyer's precision that leaves almost no room for reversal. Think back to how that moment felt as it unfolded. Reporters called the silence in the chamber deafening, and this time the phrase actually fits. The Senate floor is usually alive with murmurs, whispered exchanges, and the shuffle of papers. But when leadership rises to deliver something this definitive, the noise disappears because everyone in the room understands what's at stake. You might be asking why any of this should matter to you if you don't live and breathe politics. It matters because this goes far beyond insider drama. This is about the choices that will be placed in front of you as a voter in the next election cycle. It's about whether one of the country's two major parties stays bound to a single figure or fractures into something entirely new. When the most powerful Republican in Washington moves to effectively close the chapter on the party's de facto leader, it reshapes the set of options facing the entire electorate. Let's look at the speech itself. Sources I have spoken to confirm that this was not written in a fever specifically for this afternoon. This was drafted, revised, and likely vetted by legal scholars and parliamentary experts over a significant period. It was a loaded gun sitting in a desk drawer waiting for the right moment to be pulled out. McConnell didn't merely take issue with the former president's language or tone. He presented a clear, structured case about eligibility and long-term viability within the party, deliberately grounding his position in legal reasoning rather than moral judgment. In doing so, he handed his caucus something invaluable: cover. He offered them a way to say, I agree with much of the agenda, but I can't refute this argument. That distinction matters enormously. In Washington, and especially in the Senate, you don't abandon allies without first giving them an exit. Before you scuttle the ship, you lower the lifeboats. McConnell just put those lifeboats in the water. The response from Mar-a-Lago has been exactly what you'd expect: volatile and intensely personal. Reports describe real anger, not just performative outrage, and a sense of betrayal that cuts deeper than the usual public insults. According to insiders, the former president feels stabbed in the back by someone he believes owes him for past political victories. But this kind of backlash was never a surprise. It was anticipated, even welcomed. By positioning himself squarely in the line of fire, McConnell turns himself into the lightning rod that allows vulnerable senators in swing states to remain silent while leadership absorbs the attack. It's a textbook leadership maneuver. Take the hit at the top so everyone else has room to survive. The danger, though, is massive. This isn't a minor disagreement or a passing spat. It raises the real possibility of an internal rupture within the Republican base itself. That forces a bigger question. Why now? After everything that has already happened, why is this the moment the wall finally gives way? To understand that, you have to look beyond what plays on cable news, the rallies, the applause lines, the loyal crowds, and toward what's happening in private rooms, at closed door fundraisers, and strategy meetings in Washington. Behind the scenes, anxiety has been building among major donors and party institutionalists that the current trajectory ends in long term minority status. McConnell's self assigned role is simple: win elections. And if he has concluded that the former president has become a drag on the party rather than a driver of victory, he will act accordingly. What we witnessed today was exactly that: a calculated, emotionless severing of the line. Making that cut is one thing, enduring the fallout is another. That's why the reported signal matters. In the Senate, moves like this are almost never solo acts. When a minority leader steps this far out, it's usually because he knows he has enough backing to withstand what comes next. This suggests that conversations have been happening in the cloakrooms and the private dining rooms for weeks. Senators who had never criticized Trump on camera may have been urging McConnell to do this in private. It creates a dynamic where the public face of the party is at war with its private reality. You are watching a party try to metabolize its own history and decide if it can digest it or if it has to reject it entirely. As we go further into this, it's important to notice that McConnell's wording was crafted for repetition. When he talked about the party moving on, that wasn't casual phrasing, it was an instruction. He is attempting to manufacture reality by declaring it. If a figure with enough authority says something is finished and enough people accept that premise, then it effectively becomes finished. In Washington, power often operates as perceived momentum. Convince enough players that the train is already pulling out, and they'll sprint to avoid being left behind. McConnell is sounding the whistle. The open question is who jumps aboard and who ends up stranded on the platform. That brings us to what happens next in practical terms. You might assume we've seen this pattern before. Trump is criticized, he strikes back, and the critic eventually disappears. But this situation is fundamentally different because of the institutional gravity involved. The Senate Minority Leader controls campaign money. He influences committee placements. When his party is in power, he dictates the legislative timetable. When McConnell speaks, he does so backed by the full weight of the Senate's machinery. This isn't social media sniping, it's the erection of a structural barrier. Now consider the timing. We're in a moment when the political terrain is shifting quickly. By acting now, McConnell is trying to shape the battlefield before the next round of primaries locks everyone into place. He wants to define what comes after Trump before that definition is imposed on him. The stakes could not be higher. If this fails, he risks losing control of the conference and possibly how history remembers him. If it works, he fundamentally alters the direction of American conservatism for decades. And as we keep unpacking the fallout, keep this in mind. For the average voter, this may sound like distant political noise, but the effects of this speech will quietly filter down into the choices on the ballot, the candidates you see, and the direction of the country itself, all the way down to your local ballot. It will shape who ends up running for Senate in your state, the kind of advertising that floods your screens, and the issues that rise to the top of Washington's agenda. This moment is the starting gun for the next several years of political conflict. And to understand why, we have to examine the precise arguments McConnell chose to make and the exact language he used. In the Senate, words are never casual. Every phrase is measured, and today that balance shifted. When it shifts in that chamber, it almost never swings back. That brings us to the heart of what actually happened on the floor. Strip away the headlines and the social media shockwaves. And what McConnell delivered looked far less like a campaign speech and far more like a constitutional brief. He wasn't speaking to the cameras or the crowd. He was speaking to history and, just as importantly, to the hardline textualists inside his own party. The core of his case rested on a narrow but powerful interpretation of eligibility and the obligations of public office, an interpretation that often gets overlooked. by grounding his opposition in constitutional responsibility rather than personal judgment. He removed the emotional burden for his colleagues. The message was simple and devastating. You don't have to despise him to oppose him. You just have to obey the law. That framing gives nervous senators an enormous psychological shield. It allows them to return home and tell their voters that their hands were tied by the Constitution itself, a document their base holds sacred. For lawmakers staring down the threat of a primary challenge, that distinction could make all the difference. You need to understand the mechanism here. In the Senate, procedure is policy. The way a question is framed determines the answer. McConnell knows that if the vote is framed as, "Do you like Donald Trump?" he loses half his caucus. But if the vote is framed as, "Do you support the integrity of the institution and the rule of law as defined by this specific statute?" the calculus shifts entirely. A substantial portion of his remarks today was devoted to laying out the precedents for disqualification. This is the legal framework sources have been quietly buzzing about. It wasn't a hazy moral rebuke or a rhetorical scolding. It was a blueprint, one that leads to a conviction carrying the explicit consequence of being barred from holding future office. He referenced specific statutes and historical cases that most of the public and frankly much of the press had long since forgotten. In effect, he was equipping the jurors, the senators, with the legal tools they would need to vote guilty without it appearing as though they were simply surrendering to Democratic pressure. This is where the gap between political theater and institutional reality becomes critical to understand. From the outside, it looks like betrayal. Inside the building, it looks like an extraction operation designed to save the party's governing structure. The institution I keep returning to, the Senate itself, has a kind of self-preservation instinct. It resists forces that threaten its authority or diminish its relevance. For years, the Senate bent toward the executive branch because it was politically convenient to do so. Today, McConnell sent a clear message that the Senate is reclaiming its ground. He is telling the executive branch and the former president in particular that the legislature is not a ceremonial bystander. What we are witnessing is a rebalancing of power that extends far beyond a single headline. It is the system correcting course. So, let's slow down and define a few terms you're going to hear repeatedly in the days ahead so the procedural language doesn't obscure what's really happening. You'll hear a lot about closure, conviction thresholds, and disqualification. Closure simply means ending debate and forcing a vote, and McConnell is signaling he will not stand in the way of that process. The conviction threshold refers to the two-thirds majority required to secure a conviction. On paper, McConnell is just one vote, but in practice, as leader, he sets the tone. When he signals that senators may vote their conscience without fear of leadership retaliation, he dramatically lowers the psychological barrier to defection. He isn't forcing the door open himself. He's unlocking it and stepping aside. And disqualification is the real objective. It's the final sanction, the one that permanently bars a removed or convicted official from ever holding federal office again. That is the bullseye. Everything McConnell said today was tightly aimed at reaching that exact line in the rulebook. So why should this matter to you at home, worrying about inflation, the border, or healthcare costs? Because the individual who occupies the Oval Office ultimately shapes the trajectory of all of it. If one of the dominant figures in the race is effectively taken off the board by his own party, the entire field shifts. The primary you may vote in next year suddenly looks nothing like what you expected. The national conversation moves away from relitigating the last election and toward competing visions for what comes next. You may feel a sense of relief, or you may feel robbed, as if an entrenched system is stripping away a choice you believe belongs to voters. That reaction is understandable. What you're watching is a collision between two forces: populism driven by mass support and raw energy, and institutionalism grounded in rules, norms, and power structures. McConnell is the embodiment of the institution. Trump is the embodiment of disruption. And today, the institution didn't just defend itself, it counterattacked. To understand how we got to this breaking point, we have to rewind a bit. This didn't happen in a vacuum. The tension between the establishment GOP and the mega movement has been the defining story of the last decade, but it was always held together by a fragile truce. We tolerate the chaos because we get the judges and the tax cuts. That was the deal. McConnell was the architect of that deal. He endured the insults, the late night tweets, and the erratic behavior because he was getting what he wanted, a conservative judiciary and a deregulation agenda. But the math changed for the party establishment. The return on investment collapsed, electoral defeats piled up, the non-stop turbulence made message discipline impossible. At a certain point, the chaos began to cost more than it delivered. You also have to factor in what's been happening inside the conference itself. The full group of Republican senators in those closed-door lunches, the atmosphere has been shifting for months. Staffers describe a deep, grinding exhaustion. It's not just the scandal of the week. It's the reality that nothing else can breathe because all the oxygen is consumed by the former president. There is a quiet but powerful longing among career lawmakers to get back to legislating, to arguing over budgets and foreign policy instead of endlessly defending the indefensible. McConnell felt that fatigue building. He understands his members' instincts sometimes better than they do. He waited until exhaustion crested, until frustration finally outweighed fear, and only then did he act. He didn't manufacture the wave. He chose the precise moment to ride it. Consider the incentives at play. A senator wants two things: re-election and influence. If loyalty to Trump secures a primary victory but guarantees a loss in the general election, that senator forfeits power. If the party locks itself into permanent minority status because it remains bound to a deeply polarizing figure, that senator has no leverage at all. What McConnell offered today was at its core an electability case dressed in constitutional language. The subtext was clear. If we don't do this, we're lost in the wilderness for a generation. That is an incredibly strong motivator for people whose careers are defined by access to power. Which brings us to how this so-called betrayal, as loyalists frame it, actually unfolded. Moves like this don't happen in a vacuum. You don't walk onto the Senate floor and deliver a speech like that without first taking the temperature. There were phone calls, dozens of them. McConnell may not have revealed every word in advance, but he absolutely tested who would stand with him. He likely assembled a Praetorian Guard, a small circle of senior senators prepared to back him publicly the moment the speech ended, and we saw that play out almost immediately. Within minutes of McConnell leaving the podium, several senior Republicans issued statements mirroring his concerns. That wasn't spontaneous. That was coordination. That was the choreography of an internal power move executed through press releases and floor remarks. They created a surround sound effect where this no longer looked like one man breaking ranks, but the sudden emergence of consensus among the party's elders. It's also important to understand the role of the donors in all of this. The individuals writing seven-figure checks have been quietly withholding funds or redirecting them elsewhere. They crave stability. Markets detest uncertainty, and big business, which has long been a natural ally of the GOP, has grown weary of the constant unpredictability. McConnell serves as their intermediary. When the money talks, the Senate Minority Leader listens. It's highly likely that top benefactors either gave a green light or issued a stark ultimatum: fix the party or we pull out. When you witness a move this audacious, always trace the money trail. It usually reveals who demanded a course correction. So we have several layers converging. First, the public event, a scathing speech invoking constitutional disqualification. Second, the mechanism, a carefully coordinated system giving senators cover to vote for conviction without fear of reprisal. Third, the backdrop, a slow erosion of trust compounded by donor pressure and institutional fatigue. But how were the precise tactical choices made? Why was today the day that hinges on the Senate's internal timeline and the rhythms of the news cycle? They needed a moment when the former president was particularly vulnerable or when a recent event provided fresh leverage. They acted during a window where public opinion was more malleable. Next, let's break down how the narrative itself was crafted, how each word, each emphasis, and each pause was chosen to maximize impact. McConnell's team likely war-gamed every possible response from Trump. They knew he would attack McConnell's wife. They knew he would threaten primaries. They knew he would call for McConnell's removal as leader. They baked that into the cake. They decided that the damage Trump could do from the outside was manageable compared to the damage he was doing from the inside. It was a triage decision. Cut the limb to save the body. You are watching a high-stakes amputation in real time, and like any surgery, it is messy, it is painful, and the patient, the Republican Party, is currently in shock. But as I lay this out, don't make the mistake of thinking the story ends here. This is merely the end of the beginning. The Civil War referenced in the title is not hyperbole. We are on the verge of a fracture in the American right that hasn't been seen since arguably the Bull Moose Party split in 1912. On one side stands the establishment apparatus, think tanks, Senate leadership, Wall Street donors. On the other side is the populist energy, the grassroots base, alternative media, and the fervent personal loyalty to one man. McConnell just fired the opening shot in what could become a very hot conflict. He is betting that institutional structure can withstand the turbulence, but structures have limits. If the base revolts, if voters decide they care more about the man than the machinery, McConnell risks becoming the leader of an empty shell. That is the gamble he made today. He wagered the entire House on his ability to steer the ship, but he may have just staged a mutiny against the captain only to find the crew jumping overboard. This brings us to the specific actors now facing a critical choice. Grab a life vest or go down with the ship. McConnell may be the architect of today's strategy, but he can't execute it alone. To secure a conviction and the resulting disqualification, he needs 66 votes. That's the magic number. The key players in this high-stakes whipping operation fall into three distinct groups because McConnell's speech was carefully tailored to speak to each one differently. First are the institutionalists. These senators, often approaching the end of their careers, see themselves as guardians of the Senate's legacy. For them, McConnell's constitutional framing was all the cover they needed. They've been waiting for leadership to provide a duty-driven rationale so they can oppose a figure they privately dislike without it appearing personal. They form the bedrock of this effort. Then there are the 2028 hopefuls. These senators have their eyes on the White House. They see the former president not as a guide, but as a barrier. As long as he dominates the landscape, their ambitions remain frozen. McConnell handed them a path to clear the field. Publicly, they will speak of sorrow and heavy hearts. Privately, they are calculating that a vote to convict is essentially a vote to protect and advance their own future viability. But the third group is the most critical and the most difficult, the vulnerable incumbents in deep red states. These are the men and women who are terrified of their own voters. They know that if they vote to convict, they will face a primary challenger funded by the MAGA wing almost immediately. McConnell's speech was designed to give them a shield, but it is a thin one. He is essentially asking them to commit political suicide for the good of the party structure. What we are hearing from sources is that McConnell is promising them protection, funding from the Senate Leadership Fund, endorsements from other heavy hitters, and perhaps a guarantee that the donor class will have their backs. It is a protection racket, plain and simple. Vote with me, and I will make sure you survive the fallout. Whether they trust him enough to take that leap is the question that will determine the outcome of this entire endeavor. Now we have to talk about the media ecosystem because you can't separate what happens on the Senate floor from what flashes across television screens. Normally, the former president controls the narrative because he generates the most compelling television. He drives ratings. But today, McConnell seized the news cycle by offering something even stronger than spectacle, open conflict. By declaring war, he forced conservative media outlets into an uncomfortable position. Choose a side. Pay close attention to how this is framed tonight. Is McConnell branded a traitor, or are his constitutional claims treated as serious and legitimate? That framing won't be accidental. It will be the product of intense behind-the-scenes pressure from communications teams on both sides. We already know McConnell's operation has been briefing influential anchors and opinion writers for days, walking them through the legal rationale, laying the groundwork so that when the speech landed, the coverage would focus on necessity and logic, not just shock. Then there's the echo chamber. The former president's greatest strength has always been his unfiltered connection to the base through social media. He speaks directly, bypassing institutions entirely. McConnell is the embodiment of the institution, the ultimate filter. This is a collision between the gatekeepers and the gatecrasher. That's why this moment is so dangerous for Trump. It disrupts the feedback loop. When the highest-ranking Republican in Washington declares something unacceptable, it gives ordinary voters permission to question their allegiance. It introduces doubt. And in politics, doubt is lethal. If a voter in Iowa or South Carolina hears their trusted local senator repeating McConnell's logic, the appearance of unanimous support begins to fracture. It doesn't need to collapse.